Well, I'm really pleased that this afternoon we're going to be talking to Sass Linekin, who is one of Maine's leaders on in climate justice and all things environmental. And I've asked her to come and share her story, how she became an activist, what drives her passion, what growing up made a difference in her life to her story, and what she's up to now. So,
Well,
looking forward to hearing from you, Sass.
thank you very much for having me here. Um, sorry. In terms of what really drives me, or historically what has, um, I come from a family of old hippies who were active in the anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s, and so I grew up in a household that was very forthwith about the need to be critical thinking in terms of the way that our systems work. And so I've always sort of had a healthy skepticism, and I think really what got me first was my pacifist nature. The first time I ever really found myself getting involved in political activism was in 2003 when we invaded Iraq for reasons that had nothing to do with 9/11, but they were talking about them as if they were. And because I grew up in a house where it wasn't expected of me to just listen to my leaders without a critical ear, I was keenly aware that what was being said to me was not the truth. So that's where I started in activist work, I guess I'd put it that way, or being active in a community that was not afraid to protest. So I was going to a lot of protests and doing things like joining drum circles and such when I was there, and just trying to build community.
How old were you then?
At that time, I was, let's see, 2003, I was in my early 20s. Up to that point, I really had no connection. I grew up kind of low income and didn't have so much social capital at that point, so I didn't even really know how to plug in. And it was actually through my mother. She became part of a Universalist church, and some of the people there were active in the community in Boston. And so they gave me the information about when demonstrations were occurring and such, and so I started going. And then I struggled pretty significantly throughout my 20s to where I was so focused on what I needed to do to survive that I didn't have a whole lot of time for activism. And then I moved to Maine about 9 years ago. And once I got here, I started to go to school online until I found Unity College. And I enrolled there in 2011, and that's where my activism really took off. I am, in terms of like a spiritual background, I'd call myself maybe somewhat of a radical pagan. I align sort of with Wicca, but in my own sense. I'm not part of a coven or anything like that, but I believe strongly in the tenets of honoring my creator by honoring the creation. So I've always had a really strong tie to the earth, and feeling that I have a need to protect animals and the environment in general. So going to Unity College, it being an environmental school, really aligned with my values. And their curriculum is not only hyper-focused on sustainability science, it's also hyper-focused on getting people active in the community. Really, a lot of the education there is experiential, and so they push us to get involved with not just community groups, but political action groups as well. And that's how I stumbled upon 350 Maine. I got into a really bad car accident about a year after I started attending the school. And it was severe enough that I almost lost my life. And so when I healed and came back to the school, I had a larger sense of urgency to do something, because I became more in touch with my mortality at a younger age, and so I really started getting the sense that I don't have an endless amount of time to make change, I guess would be the way to put it. So when my school offered to take a contingent of students to Washington, D.C. for the Forward on Climate rally, I decided to go, which I normally wouldn't have made that decision. I've got kids at home, Jason's at home, Jason being my husband, and something just kind of clicked and changed, and considering a lot of the education I was getting was based on environmental issues, and particularly the effect of climate change on the environment, it seemed like the time to do it. So I went, and when I got back, the school made sure that we unpacked the experience. We didn't just go and march and come home, and that was that. It was important that the school sort of underscore what it was we could learn from it, not just from the experience, but how we could implement what we learned moving forward. And so they hooked me up with 350 Maine, and from there it was sort of history. Yeah.
Great. So, you mentioned that you had left your family at home. How active are they in the same sorts of areas that you're getting at?
Fantastically, they've become active right along with me. One of the fantastic things about the education that I've been receiving from Unity College is that I've been able to share it with my household, and I have extensively. My husband has read some of my textbooks cover to cover that I was only able to read some of the chapters of, so he's better read than me, even though I'm the one getting the degree. And so when I joined 350 Maine, he came with me, and I try to run my household similar to the way that my parents did, where I don't have a huge filter when it comes to what's wrong with the world, I guess. I try to keep a healthy balance for my daughter, not to scare her, but at the same time make sure that she understands the urgency of not polluting, and making sure that she understands that she's got the power to change things. Having come from a low-income background, that was sort of lost on me. People who live in deep poverty often don't understand that a single person can have a huge impact. And once I started getting involved with 350 Maine, and then my husband kind of joined in, and we actually did make an impact. I mean, one of the first campaigns that we worked on with them was a campaign against extreme extraction, particularly oil trains that were moving through Maine. And we started going to meetings where we were helping to organize an action where we were going to block a train that was supposed to be coming through, actually coming right by my daughter's school, and it was carrying explosive fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields. And you could almost see my daughter's school from there, and at the time I thought, well, this is no good, because I had done enough research to know that the train cars that were carrying the oil were kind of faulty, and that if the train were to derail, it was very likely that there would be an oil spill, and I didn't want to see the waterways nearby getting polluted where I know that they were delivering water to my kids' school. So I had sort of a sense to protect them, and we started to, like I said, organize and go to these meetings to set up a train blockade with, it was actually with 350 Maine and Earth First. And we ended up going through with it on June 28th of 2013. We ended up blocking a train, and 10 days later, a train derailed in Lac-Mégantic in Canada, and it exploded and killed about 50 people in the center of this really small town. And it was even now, I just got goosebumps talking about it. I mean, at the time that we made the choice to do that, it was an environmental concern pretty much only. But it became very clear at that point that, human life was at stake as well. And as I did research, I came to find that these train companies and railroads were pretty keenly aware of the fact that the train cars carrying the oil were faulty, and they were pushing them through anyway. So we continued to push, and we continued to help organize for another train blockade a few months later that occurred in Auburn. And we went through with that as well. And since there has not been oil trains coming through Maine, and so we were able to make a direct link between people power and the ability to make change. This was something that we did on our own to help assert local control, and it worked. And we were able to talk to my daughter Jade about it and let her know that, one voice, one person can make a big difference. I'm only one person, but I was one of 5 other people who got arrested that night blocking the train. And it ended up getting a lot of fanfare, and there was a lot of talk and dialogue around these oil trains, and then it stopped. And so she started to get more of a sense of the fact that perhaps she could make a change as well. And so a few months later, when there was legislation going through to be heard for the divestment of the Maine Public Pension Fund, I talked to Jade a little bit and said, hey, I'm going to be reading testimony for the president of my school. Stephen Mulkey had written testimony, but he wasn't able to go to the legislative hearing, but he wanted it to be read out loud, so he'd asked me if I would do so, and I said, sure. And I talked to her a little bit about it, and I was really excited about it, and on her own, she said, well, do you think maybe I could do something there? And I thought, yes, you can definitely do something there, and how appropriate, because, when it comes to extreme fossil fuel extraction and the connection that it has to climate change and who's going to be most widely affected by that, it's the youth of the country. And so it seemed to me the most appropriate voice at that hearing would be the one of a child. And so I said emphatically, yes, as a matter of fact, please, why don't you write a draft, bring it to me, we'll see if it needs any editing, and, we'll do a little bit of practicing, and you know what, I'll let you take the day off of school so you can come and do this, because I feel experiential learning is working for me at school, and it can work for you, and there's a lot of different ways that we can learn, and I think teaching her, the legislative process and teaching her that she's got power as an individual was just as important as learning, 2 times 2. So we went ahead and came, and she gave her testimony, and I think she did a really good job.
Great. So you've talked about being part of 350 Maine as a group that you and Jason have gotten support from and have been involved with. How important do you think community is to sustain a movement like the climate justice movement?
I think it's everything. I think that, well, I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for community. When you use the word support, that was the perfect word to use, because before I got involved with 350 Maine, I was an activist. I'm now an organizer, which gives me the opportunity to take more ownership of the change that can be made. So it not only empowers me, it helps me to empower other people, which is incredibly important. When you talk about whether or not community is important to movement building, it's the only way that you can mass mobilize is by building community with each other. And one of the things that's occurred to me along the way is that we have lost this sense of community in our society in general. When I was a kid, if we ran out of sugar, I would knock on my neighbor's door and say, do you have a cup of sugar? These days, I don't know my neighbor's name, and if I run out of a cup of sugar, I'm likely to get in my car and carbon footprint my way to the store to get the sugar. So I think it's incredibly important to set an example. You know, you have to be the change that you want to see, and we're only going to be as strong as the community that we build. And where there are strengths that I have, there are weaknesses I have, and the only way that those weaknesses can be filled is by leaning on another community member to help with that. And maybe I can give a strength that they may have a weakness on, and it's just a really good way to build a strong foundation.
Like the way you said that. That's great. Where do you see the passion and spirit moving today, kind of a creative energy? I mean, I've been aware that for many people, where at one time their source of creative energy and passion and sense of community came from being part of a faith community. That's been traditional. You look at communities and see what's at the center. It's been the church and the Grange. And those institutions have both been losing membership, especially in the faith community, rapidly, and Granges are starting to come back. Do you think there is some place that need for coming together around common values and so on is? Are there other institutions or other places where that's beginning to emerge?
I think in the youth movement, absolutely. I'm part of a group called the Maine Students for Climate Justice, and they're trying to bring a strong youth voice going on. I think it's very intuitive that you would find religious institutions being involved in trying to protect the environment, because that's a connection to God. But when you take it a step beyond that as well and think, you know, when we talk about the future, who's going to inherit that? It's going to be the youth. And so I think there's a lot of energy and creativity that's being generated by the youth as they come up. And I think that the internet's been a fantastic tool for really spreading awareness. Yeah.
You know, I set off on this whole journey that I'm on in trying to gather stories of Maine activists of all ages and persuasions, because I was struck that there's great similarities to the 1960s civil rights movement and also the Red Power movement, that we're all coming together at the same time. There was also the anti-war movement. So in three different places, it was youth that were asserting leadership, and I know in particular with the civil rights movement and the Red Power movement, it was kind of pushing aside leaders who are still perceived as leaders, but the adult leaders, and young people being willing to risk everything because they could not see a future. And I see some of that happening today with the climate movement, that people are willing to risk arrest and so on because the hope is that we can have that the future we envision of clean energy and a community that is not unjust, two negatives there, or that is just in every sense, is only possible potentially with people being willing to put their bodies and hearts on the line. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that that's what gives me a sense of optimism, is that when you look back on history and you think about all the sort of institutionalized societal structures that we've had that did not work for any sense of justice, it's been people who are willing to put their lives on the line to make that change. And I'm sure that at the time it didn't seem possible. When you think about institutions like slavery or the way that women used to be oppressed, or in particular, I think about the anti-war movement a lot, not just because my parents were a part of it, but also because I think about the military-industrial complex. And I think it was people taking to the streets that put an end to the Vietnam War. They took to the streets and they stopped it, and that was one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the United States military-industrial complex. And they took to the streets and they won. And I think these are the kind of things that it's probably typical for somebody to look at and say, this is just such an enormous problem that there's no way we can overtake it. But really, I think it's a lot about perspective. We can look at some of the problems as really large burdens that we have to carry and figure out how to fix in like kind of a stressful sort of lens if we want, or we can look at it as an opportunity to get creative. You know, there's never been a more important time than now to make changes, and we have the ability to create a new way of living, and we have to. There's no way that we can sustain living the way that we do now. So we're alive in a really exciting time where we have the ability to kind of take out the proverbial paintbrush and say, this is the world I want to see, and make it so. And so I think it's not surprising that there is this sense of urgency and this sense of needing to put our bodies on the line, because I think otherwise there's, you know, what is there going to be? At this point, climate change is not on its way. It's here. Ask any fisherman in Maine, they will tell you. And it's just not a question. And the youth can see it because they're going to inherit it. So I think that there's a little bit less of a sense of denial there. And probably even a healthy sense of anger, maybe. I know I'm angry. I look at my daughter. For instance, I look at the fact that the 2 children that I have were not with my current husband. I would have really loved to have had a child with him, and I won't, because I am very scared about what the future holds for my kids. That really makes me mad, and it makes me scared for them, and it makes me scared for their children. And so, you know, I'm definitely willing to put my body on the line, and I would hope that the majority of people who are aware would be as well.
Great. So what's next for you on your journey, Sass?
Well, I am getting ready to get my degree from Unity College, which I'm ultra proud of. I love that school so much. They've done so much to get me active and get me empowered. And I have just taken on the role of program coordinator for an organization called Resources for Organizing and Social Change, where I'm going to get an opportunity to pretty much get paid to do the work of promoting social justice and climate justice. And the two are so very interlinked. You know, people talk about climate change in terms of clean energy all the time, and it's certainly not something to be ignored. The reason that we're in the problems or having the problems that we're having today is because of the combustion of fossil fuels. But the reason that we're combusting fossil fuels at the rate that we are is because we are taking advantage of lesser nations. That was a really bad way to say that. I'm sorry. We've been taking advantage of people who have less. It's not the upper white middle class who's living next to the landfills, you know. And if we don't promote a sense of social justice in the world, if we don't change the structures that allow us to just keep over-consuming at the price of these other nations who don't have the same ability to speak for themselves, the problem isn't going to be fixed. So I don't think it's going to be solved by a solar panel alone. I think it's also going to be solved by empowering the people who are being taken advantage of.
Now you did a film and a project in Iceland. What did you find there that inspired you or challenged you?
Well, it was challenging being away from my family for as long as I was. I went to Iceland for 12 weeks on a study abroad program where I had the once in a lifetime experience of getting to go and live in a small eco village far away from Reykjavik. So it was just this quiet little place. There was only about 100 people that lived there, and 50% of the people who lived there were special needs. And so they sort of integrate ecological and social justice in this village, because one of the tenets of the place is that the people with special needs don't need to acclimate and figure out how to live in our world. We need to acclimate to their special needs. And so it gave me this fantastic shift in thinking. And this is the place where I went, where I figured out the real connection between social justice and climate change solutions. Beforehand, well, when I went to Iceland, I went with the focus to go there and learn about green energy. That was what I thought I was going to go, learn, come back, and talk about. And instead, I'm actually not done with my film yet, but I'm in the process of creating a film that talks about the need to change our social structures. That's what I came away with the most. You know, we went there and we did learn about green energy. I learned about geothermal and I learned about hydropower, but I also learned that depending on your perspective, you know, hydropower is clean and renewable, and it's better than burning oil or coal. But if you're a fish, it's not. So it gave me this sort of holistic sense of taking a true stock of what the price is of our consumption habits. And it made me kind of step back and say, is the only answer green energy? It's certainly one of the answers, but if we don't change the way that we live, we're just continuing to prop up a society